This is part 2 of chapter 14. And yeah, in January, George had tried out with 24 others for the debate team. He had been quite frankly with Jack. His father was a corporation lawyer, and he wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. George, who felt no burning call to do anything else, was willing. His grades were not top end, but this was, after all, only prep school, and it was still early times. If should be became to must be. His father could pull some strings. George's own athletic ability would open still other doors, but Brian Hatfield thought his son should get on the debate team. It was good practice, and it was something that law school admissions boards always looked for, so George went out for debate, and in late March, Jack cut him from the team. The late winter inter-squad debates had fired George Hatfield's competitive soul. He became a grimly determined debater, prepping his pro or con position fiercely. It didn't matter if the subject was legalization of marijuana, restraining the death penalty, or the oil depletion allowance. George became conversant, and he was just jingoist enough to honestly not care which side he was on, a rare or invaluable trait even in high-level debaters. Jack knew the souls of a true carpetbagger and a true debater were not far removed from each other. They were both passionately interested in the main chance. So far, so good, but George Hatfield stuttered. This was not a handicap that had even shown up in the classroom, where George was always cool and collected. Whether he had done his homework or not, and certainly not on the Stovington playing fields, where talk was not a virtue, and they sometimes even threw you out of the game for too much discussion. When George got tightly wound up in a debate, the stutter would come out. The more eager he became, the worse it was. And when he felt he had an opponent dead in his sights, an intellectual sort of buck fever seemed to take place between his speech centers and his mouth, and he would freeze solid when the clock ran out. It was painful to watch. So I think we may have to say the facts in the case. Mr. Dorsky, sites are rendered obsolete by the recent decisions handed in the down in. The buzzer would go off, and Jack would whirl down to stare furiously at Jack, who sat beside it. George's face at those moments would be flushed. His notes crumpled spasmodically in one hand. Jack had held on to George long after he had cut most of the obvious flat tires, hoping George would work out. He remembered one late afternoon about a week before he had reluctantly dropped the axe. George had stayed after the others had filled out, and then had confronted Jack angrily. "You set the timer ahead." Jack looked up from the papers he was putting back into his briefcase. "George, what are you talking about? I didn't get my whole 5 minutes. You set it ahead. I was watching the clock. The clock and the timer may keep slightly different times, George, but I never touched the dial on the damn thing. Scout's honor. You did." The belligerent, "I'm sticking up for my rights" way George was looking at him, and had sparked Jack's own temper. He had been off the sauce for 2 months. 2 months too long. He was ragged. He made one last effort to hold himself in. "I assure you I did not, George. It's your stutter. Do you have any idea what causes it? You don't stutter in class." "I don't stutter. Lower your voice. You will want to get me, and don't want me to get your goddamn team. Lower your voice," I said. "Let's discuss this rationally." Fuck that. "George, if you can control your stutter, I'd be glad to have you. You're well prepped for every practice, and you're good at the background stuff, which means you're rarely surprised. But all that doesn't mean much if you can't control that." "I never stuttered," he cried out. "It's you. If someone else had the debate team, I could." Jack's temper slipped another notch. George, you're never going to make much of a lawyer, corporation, or otherwise if you can't control that. Law isn't like soccer. 2 hours of practice every night won't cut it. What are you going to do, stand up in front of a board meeting and say, no, now, gentlemen, this tort. He suddenly flushed, not with anger, but with shame at his own cruelty. This was not a man in front of him, but a 17-year-old boy who was facing the first major defeat of his life, and maybe asking in the only way he could for Jack to help him find a way to cope with it. George gave him a final furious glance, his lips twisting and bucking as the words bottled up behind him, struggling to find their way out. You said it ahead. You hate me because no. With an inarticulate cry, he had rushed out of the classroom, slamming the door hard enough to make the wire-reinforced glass rattle in its frame. Jack had stood there, feeling rather than hearing the echo of George's Adidas in the empty hall, still in the grip of his temper and his shame at mocking George's stutter. His first thought had been sick sort of exhaustion. For the first time in his life, George Hatfield had wanted something he could not have. For the first time, there was something wrong that all of Daddy's money could not fix. You couldn't bribe a speech center. You couldn't offer a tongue an extra $50 a week and a bonus at Christmas if it would stop agreeing to stop flapping like a record needle in a defective groove. Then the exultation was simply buried in shame, and he felt the way he had after he had broken Danny's arm. Dear God, I'm not a son of a bitch, please. That sick happiness that George's retreat was more typical of Denker in the play than of Jack Torrance the playwright. You hate me because you know. Because he knew what? What could he possibly know about George Hatfield that would make him hate him? That his whole future lay ahead of him. That he looked a little bit like Robert Redford, and all conversation among the girls stopped when he had a double gainer from the pool diving board. That he played soccer and baseball with a natural, unlearned grace. Ridiculous, absolutely absurd. He envied George Hatfield nothing. If the truth was known, he felt worse about George's unfortunate stutter than George himself, because George really would have made an excellent debater. And if Jack had set the time ahead, and of course he hadn't, it would have been because both he and the other members of the squad were embarrassed for George's struggle. They had agonized over it the way you agonize when the class night speaker forgets some of his lines if he had set the timer ahead. It would have been just to put George out of his misery. But he hadn't set the timer ahead. He was quite sure of it. A week later he had cut him, and that time he had kept his temper. The shouts and the threats had all been on George's side. A week after that he had gone out in the parking lot halfway through the practice to get a pile of source books, that he had left his trunk open when there had been George down on one knee with his long blonde hair swinging in his face, a hunting knife in one hand. He was sawing through the Volkswagen's front tire. The back tires were already shredded, and the bug sat on the flats like a small, tired dog. Jack had seen red and remembered very little of the encounter that followed. He remembered a thick growl that seemed to issue from his own throat. All right, George, if that's how you want it, just come here and take your medicine. He remembered George looking up, startled and fearful. He had said, Mr. Torrance, as if to explain how all this was just a mistake. The tires had been flat when he got there and was just cleaning dirt out of the front treads with the tip of his gutting knife. He just happened to have with him, and Jack had waded in, his fists held up in front of him, and it seemed that he had been grinning. But he wasn't sure of that. The last thing he remembered was George holding up the knife and saying, You better not come any closer. And the next thing was Miss Strong, the French teacher, holding Jack's arms, crying, screaming, Stop it, Jack, stop it, you're going to kill him. He had blinked around stupidly. There was the hunting knife glittering harmlessly on the parking lot, asphalt 4 yards away. There was his Volkswagen, his poor old battered bug, veteran of many wild night wild midnight drunken rides, sitting on 3 flat shoes. There was a new dent on his right front fender. He saw, and there was something in the middle of the dent that was either red paint or blood. For a moment he had been confused. His thoughts, Jesus Christ, Al, we hit him again. We hit him after all. Of that other night. Then his eyes had shifted to George lying dazed and blinking on the asphalt. His debate group had come out, and they were huddled together by the door, staring at George. There was blood on his face from a scalp laceration that looked minor, but there was also blood running out of one of George's ears that had probably meant a concussion. When George tried to get up, Jack shook free of Miss Strong and went to him. George cringed. Jack put his hands on George's chest and pushed him back down. Lie still, he said. Don't try to move. He turned to Miss Strong, who was sitting at them both with horror. Please go call the school doctor, Miss Strong, he told her. She turned and fled toward the office. He looked at his debate class, then looked them right in the eye, because he was in charge again, fully himself, and when he was himself, there wasn't a nice guy in the whole state of Vermont. Surely they knew that. You can go home now, he told them quietly. We'll meet again tomorrow. By the end of the week, 6 of his debaters had dropped. By that week, 6 of his debaters had dropped out, 2 of them the class of the act, but, of course, it didn't matter much, because he had been informed by then that he would be dropping out himself. Yet somehow he had stayed off the bottle, and he supposed that was something. And he had not hated George Hatfield, he was sure of that, and had not acted, but had been acted upon. You hate me because you know. But he had known nothing. He would swear that before the throne of Almighty God, just as he would swear that he had set the timer ahead no more than a minute, and not out of hate, but out of pity. 2 wasps were crawling sluggishly about on the roof beside the hole in the flashing. He watched them until they spread their aerodynamically unsound but strangely efficient wings and lumbered off into the October sunshine, perchance to sting something else. God had seen fit to give them stingers, and Jack supposed they had to use them on somebody. How long he had been sitting here, looking at the hole with its unpleasant surprise down inside, raking over old coals. He looked at his watch. Almost half an hour. He let himself down to the edge of the roof, dropped one leg over, and felt around until his foot found the top rung of the ladder. Just below the overhang, he would go down to the equipment shed, where he had stored the bug bomb on the high shelf out of Danny's reach. He would get it, come back up, and then they would be the one surprised. You could be stung, but you could also sting back. He believed that sincerity. 2 hours from now, the nest would be just so much chewed paper, and Danny could have it in his room if he wanted to. Jack had one in his room, but he was just a kid. It had always smelled faintly of wood smoke and gasoline. He could have it right by the head of his bed. It wouldn't hurt him. I'm getting better. The sound of his own voice, confident in the silent afternoon, reassured him, even though he hadn't meant to speak aloud. He was getting better. It was possible to graduate from passive to active. To take the thing that had once driven you nearly to madness as a neutral prize of no more than occasional academic interest. And if there was a place where the thing could be done, this was surely it. He went down the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay. They would pay for stinging him.